From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The Senate passes a $95 billion bipartisan bill with defense aid for Israel, Ukraine, and Taiwan. But will Speaker Mike Johnson try to block it? Plus, New Yorkers go to the polls in a snowstorm to pick a successor for the congressional fabulist George Santos. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, Kate Batchelder-Odell, Kim Strassel, and Faith Bottom. After a long night of speechifying, it was about 5 a.m. this morning in the Senate when this bill finally passed, with about $14 billion for Israel and $60 billion for Ukraine. But in the end, the vote belied that overnight drama. The vote was 70-29 in the Senate, with 22 Republican yeses and 26 noes. Let's start with a clip of the Senate Majority Leader, Democrat Chuck Schumer, on the message that he would now deliver to Speaker Mike Johnson.
I would hope to speak to Speaker Johnson directly. And my message is, this is a rare moment where history is looking upon the United States and seeing if we will stand up for our values, stand up to bullies like Putin, and do the right thing. I will say to Speaker Johnson, I am confident that there's a large majority in the House who will vote for this bill. I am confident there are many Republicans in his caucus, I know I've spoken to a whole bunch of them, who feel strongly we ought to pass this bill. And I will urge Speaker Johnson to step up to the moment and do the right thing.
Kate, to start at the beginning, what is in this $95 billion bill that the Senate has now passed with a pretty solid majority, and what do you make of the contents?
Well, I think one of the reasons that it commanded a solid majority is that while the focus is on how many dollars are for Ukraine or it's billed as a foreign aid bill, the bill really is a substantive down payment on rebuilding U.S. defenses. And I think it's important to think about it that way amid so much political polarization over Ukraine. So let me go through a couple of quick hits of what's in this bill. About 60% of the top line funding is fed into the U.S. defense industrial base to get moving on replenishing our own stocks. For instance, there's $26 billion in this bill that is replenishment funding for the Pentagon to replace weapons that we've given to Ukraine. So even if you don't support Ukraine, surely you would support restocking the weapons we have already sent them. There is $3 billion in this bill to help expand the submarine industrial base expansion. The Navy really wants more submarines to compete with China, but we're struggling to make them. And this has helped develop workers and some of the other problems we're having in building those submarines. There's $11 billion in the bill that is supporting U.S. troops that are working overtime in Europe. Surely this is something that should command bipartisan support. We have extended ships in the area and aircraft and are working them harder than we normally do. So, of course, we want to pay for the maintenance and the costs of all of that. And then, of course, there's about $15 billion for the Ukraine security assistance, which is basically allows Ukraine to buy weapons that are then made in the United States that we sell them U.S. weapons. So that is just a rundown of the basics of the Ukraine section. But there's also money for Israel to really help build out their Iron Dome missile defense, and also some foreign military sales money for our Pacific partners. So that's really the thrust of the bill, and why I think it did get 70 votes is because it's a much larger bill that deals with much larger stakes than merely Ukraine. It's really a bill about what's going on in the world as a whole and whether the U.S. is going to be able to defend itself.
Kim, where does this legislation go from here? You heard the message from Senator Chuck Schumer to the speaker on the other side of the U.S. Capitol. But here is what Speaker Mike Johnson is saying. The mandate of national security supplemental legislation was to secure America's own border before sending additional foreign aid around the world. Now, in the absence of having received any single border policy change from the Senate, the House will have to continue to work its own will on these important matters. And Kim, the reason I think that is a fascinating line for the speaker to take, and you heard some members of the Senate also making that argument overnight, including Utah's Mike Lee, is my understanding was that this was the Republican position, that we needed some border changes in this bill. And lo and behold, we got a bill negotiated by the Republican Senator James Lankford that included some border provisions, which Republicans then rejected. And so, Kim, where does this go in the House? Because it seems to me that Speaker Mike Johnson does not want to get to yes.
We've gone full circle, and it's now become somewhat absurd. As you say, the argument was we need a strong border security provisions. That's exactly what was negotiated. The minute it was released, it was declared dead on arrival in the House. By the way, I would note that one of the arguments was, we don't even need border provisions because President Biden has all the power he needs right now to do everything to stop the problem at the border. Now that the bill has no border provisions in it, we've apparently dropped that line again. And now we're saying that we must have border provisions again, and that the bill is dead on arrival because it doesn't have border provisions in it. It's really quite absurd. And I think, to your point, it does seem to be Johnson, at this point, the tail wagging the dog, the House Freedom Caucus and Donald Trump deciding on a whim day by day how they're going to feel about this as an excuse not to pass it. There's a couple of ways that this can go now. Each of them, though, have their own risks. One is that Johnson, if he really was committed to getting this done, I think that's still uncertain. He could try to just simply attach it to a must-pass piece of legislation. One problem there is there isn't a lot of those around right now, in particular because some of the, for instance, individual spending bills aren't necessarily must pass on their own, although we will have to do something about a coming shutdown. That would court a lot of blowback from his Republicans, though, if that was the way he went. He could put it on the floor. This would be my preference. Tee it up, have it get to the floor, let people amend it. If Republicans think there's a problem, then work their will on the floor and change the bill in a way that they think will make it work. That has a lot of risks to it as well. So right now, the thing that most people seem to be talking about is a discharge petition in which Democrats could go around the speaker to put this legislation on the floor. At the moment, every single Democrat, 213, has signed a discharge petition. You need a simple majority to get there. They would need 5 Republicans to sign on. And this is also Johnson's risk, which is there is a sizable contingency of Republicans in the House that do want this aid and this money for the very strong national security reasons Kate outlined. I don't think it would take much if it looked as though this really were dead to maybe get those 5 Republicans to sign on and get this onto the floor.
Hang tight. We'll be right back with more on this in a moment. Welcome back. Kate, a couple more points from the Senate debate. What do you make of some of these no votes from senators who present themselves as hawkish on foreign policy, including Tom Cotton and Lindsey Graham? And can you speak a little bit about how the Senate Republicans worked on improving this bill over what President Biden originally requested in aid to these countries?
Yeah, I think some of those no votes, the politics of the border have consumed so much oxygen on Capitol Hill. And so they are using the border fight as an excuse not to vote for Ukraine funding, which I think is unfortunate. I also think some of the GOP, outside of those hawkish senators that you mentioned, some of the GOP criticism to Ukraine aid has been, one, we provide too much financial aid, too much economic aid, we're paying salaries or pensions. You hear that line a lot. And Europe should do more of that. Well, in this particular case, the Senate bill cut by about 30%, by about $4 billion, the amount of direct budget support that President Biden requested. So that's an improvement. The Senate also included a clause trying to coax out a strategy in Ukraine and the objectives that the Biden administration attempts to achieve there, which has been a core argument that there's no strategy in Ukraine, that this is a blank check. So these bills have tried to answer what legitimate objections exist. And I would just give you 3 concrete examples of the way that this bill improves our ability to defend ourselves and to prevail in a future fight. So this bill gives about $5 billion to helping get our 155 artillery rounds up to 100,000 rounds per month. This is the artillery that the Ukrainians are consuming in voracious quantities. We were at about 14,000 shells a month before the war started. But now, even if Ukraine gets some of those shells, having that capacity to produce 100,000 rounds a month would make a huge difference in our weapons arsenals. A second quick example is our Patriot air defense missiles. This bill would take us to 650 missiles a year from 550. These are the missiles Ukraine's using to defend their skies from Russian cruise missiles, a very scarce munition, and it would make a difference by the hundreds of how many we'll have over the next few years, while some are worried about a tense Pacific environment, for instance. And just lastly, real quick, the bill gives about $133 million to increase capacity for making cruise missile rocket motors. And here's why that's important. Some of my sources are really concerned about how many Tomahawk missiles we're using in the Middle East right now as we're trading fire with the Houthis. But one reason why we can't make more quickly is because the scarcity of these underlying rocket motors. And so this bill would invest money to start to fix that problem. So again, there's really been a bipartisan kind of consensus over the past couple of years that we don't have the weapons that we need if we were to get into any sort of protracted fight. And this bill really starts to get at some of those underlying problems and try to fix them. And I hope that commands a lot more attention as the House starts to look at the bill and consider passing it.
Kim, the risk here for Republicans, I think, is that I understand there's frustration at what has turned into sort of a stalemate on the front there in Ukraine, but there are all sorts of reports about supplies and munitions on the Ukrainian side starting to run low. And if what you have here is a bill to help replenish some of those supplies that passes the Senate in a strong bipartisan manner and then is held up by Speaker Johnson and other Republicans, even though a majority of the House would also be willing and happy to vote for it and get those supplies over to Ukraine's defenders, I think that what is going to end up happening is, regardless of the criticisms that Republicans have of Biden's approach to this and his lack of a real public message explaining why it is in America's interest that Vladimir Putin's invasion not succeed, Republicans will end up owning whatever happens. If you end up with a Ukrainian breakthrough on the front and a drive to take more territory later this spring, it is not hard to imagine this argument boomeranging on the Republicans who stood up and blocked this bill.
The optics and the politics of this will be absolutely terrible for Republicans. And what they're doing is making the equivalent mistake to what I think Democrats have done in the last couple of years, which is that in both parties, you have a minority that is a distinct minority when it comes to the country's views on things, but yet it has an outside voice and runs the party, as it were, because it's louder than everyone else. On the Democratic side, it's progressives. Okay, the progressive viewpoint is not one that is widely shared, even among Democrats, certainly not Republicans, and yet it has forced and pushed President Biden into all kinds of positions that ended him up sideways with the electorate. Republicans are doing the same thing here with Ukraine. Donald Trump has issues with this particular bill and continued Ukraine funding. There is his loyal following that absolutely agrees with that. You might even be having, unfortunately, a growing number of Republicans that are there. But the majority of Republicans still believe in a Reagan-like strong national defense. There's certainly a lot of support for the president in his support of Ukraine among Democrats. And Republicans are going to look like the body as a whole, however, that is standing in the way of the United States fulfilling its commitments and bonds with some of its allies, pushing back against dictators. That is not a position the Republicans have been in decades. It's not a winning position. And it's kind of remarkable to me that they are allowing themselves to get into this position.